Well, I have to ask because Ron Howard, the director, asked us on Twitter. Since we're talking about the threat of nuclear war and otherwise, he asked, I'd be interested in both your expectations for human society if when we move beyond Mars. Will those societies be industrial based? How will it be governed? How will criminal infractions be dealt with? When you read or watch sci fi, what comes closest to sounding logical? Do you think about our society beyond Earth? If we colonize Mars, if we colonize space?
Yeah, well, I think I have a pretty
Uh oh.
humbling picture of that. I mean, so because we're still going to be the apes that we are. So when you imagine colonizing Mars, you have to imagine a first fist fight on Mars.
Yeah.
You have to imagine a first murder on Mars.
Also, infidelity.
Yeah,
Somebody.
extramarital affairs on Mars, right? So it's going to get uh, really homely and boring really fast. I think it's like only the spacesuits or what the other exigencies of just living in that atmosphere or lack thereof will limit how badly we can behave on Mars.
But do you think most of the interaction will be still in meat space versus digital? Do you think there'll be? Do you think we're like living through a transformation of a kind where we're going to be doing more and more interaction in digital space? Like everything we've been complaining about Twitter, is it possible that Twitter is just the early days of a broken system that's actually giving birth to a better working system that's ultimately digital?
I think we're going to experience a pendulum swing back into the real world. I mean, I think many of us are experiencing that now anyway. I mean, just wanting to have face to face encounters and spend less time on our phones and less time online. I mean, I think maybe everyone isn't going in that direction, but I do notice it myself, and I notice. I mean, once I got off Twitter, then I noticed the people who were never on Twitter, right? And then and the people who were never basically. I mean, I have a lot of friends who are never on Twitter.
Yeah.
They actually never understood what I was doing on Twitter. It's like they just it wasn't that they were seeing it and then reacting to it. They just didn't know. It's like being on Reddit. It's like I'm not on Reddit either, but I don't spend any time thinking about not being on Reddit. Right? It's like I'm just not on Reddit.
So you think the pursuit of human happiness is better achieved, more effectively achieved outside of Twitter world?
Well, I think all we have is our attention in the end. And we just have to notice what these various tools are doing to it. And it became very clear to me that it was an unrewarding use of my attention. Now, it's not to say there isn't some digital platform that's conceivable that would be useful, but and rewarding. But yeah, I mean, we just have our life is doled out to us in moments, and we're continually solving this riddle of what is going to suffice to make this moment engaging and meaningful and aligned with who I want to be now and how I want the future to look. Right? That we have this tension between being in the present and becoming in the future, and it's a seeming paradox. Again, it's not really a paradox, but it can seem like I do think the ground truth for personal well-being is to find a mode of being where you can pay attention to the present moment. And this is, meditation by another name. You can pay attention to the present moment with sufficient, gravity that you recognize that just consciousness itself in the present moment, no matter what's happening, is already a circumstance of freedom and contentment and tranquility. Like you can be happy now before anything happens.
Mm-hmm.
Like before this next desire gets gratified, before this next problem gets solved. There's this kind of ground truth that you're free, that consciousness is free and open and unencumbered by really any problem until you get lost in thought about all the problems that may yet be real for you.
So the ability to catch and observe consciousness, that in itself is a source of happiness.
Yeah, without being lost in thought. And so what this happens haphazardly for people who don't meditate because they find something in their life that's so captivating, it's so pleasurable, it's so thrilling. It can even be scary, but it can be even being scared is captivating. Like so it gets their attention, right? Whatever it is. If you like, Sebastian Junger, was wrote a great book about people's experience in war here. It's like it can be, strangely, it can be the best experience anyone's ever had because everything, it's like only the moment matters, right? Like the bullet is whizzing by your head. You're not thinking about your 401k or that thing that you didn't say last week to the person you shouldn't have been talking about. You're not thinking about Twitter. It's like you're just fully immersed in the present moment. Um, Meditation is the only way. I mean, that word can mean many things to many people, but what I mean by meditation is simply the discovery that there is a a way to engage the present moment directly, regardless of what's happening. You don't need to be in a war. You don't need to be having sex. You don't need to be on drugs. You don't need to be surfing. You don't need nothing. It doesn't have to be a peak experience. It can be completely ordinary, but you can recognize that in some basic sense, there's only this, and everything else is something you're thinking. You're thinking about the past. You're thinking about the future, and thoughts themselves have no substance. Right? It's fundamentally mysterious that any thought ever really commandeers your sense of who you are and makes you anxious or afraid or angry or whatever it is. And the more you discover that, the half life of all these negative emotions that blow all of us around get much much shorter, right? And you can literally just the anger that would have kept you angry for hours or days lasts 4 seconds because you just the moment it arises you recognize it and you can get off that. You can decide at minimum you can decide whether it's useful to stay angry at that moment, and obviously it usually isn't.
And the illusion of free will is one of those thoughts.
Yeah, it's all just happening, right? Like even the mindful and meditative response to this is just happening. It's just like even the moments where you recognize or not recognize is just happening. It's not that this does open up a degree of freedom for a person, but it's not a freedom that gives any motivation to the notion of free will. It's just a new way of being in the world.
Is there a difference between intellectually knowing free will is an illusion and
Yeah,
really experiencing it?
yeah, yeah. Yeah.
What's the longest you've been able to experience the escape the illusion of free will?
Well, it's always it's always obvious to me when I pay attention. I mean, whenever I'm mindful, this is the term of jargon, in the Buddhist and increasingly, outside the Buddhist context is mindfulness, right? But there are sort of different levels of mindfulness, and there's different degrees of insight into this. But yes, I mean, what I'm calling evidence of lack of free will and lack of the self. I mean, like two sides of the same coin. There's a sense of being a subject in the middle of experience to whom all experience refers,
Mm-hmm.
the sense of I, the sense of me. And that's almost everybody's starting point when they start to meditate. And that's almost always the place people live most of their lives from. I do think that gets interrupted in ways that get unrecognized. I think people are constantly losing the sense of I. They're losing the sense of subject-object distance, but they're not recognizing it. And meditation is the mode in which you can recognize. You can both consciously precipitate it. You can look for the self and fail to find it, and then recognize its absence. And that's just the flip side of the coin of free will. I mean, the feeling of having free will is what it feels like to feel like a self who's thinking his thoughts and doing his actions and intending his intentions. And the man in the middle of the boat who's rowing, um, that's the start. That's the false starting point. When you find that there's no one in the middle of the boat, right? Or in fact, there's no boat. There's just the river. There's just the flow of experience, and there's no center to it, and there's no place from which you would control it. Again, even when you're doing things, this does not negate the difference between voluntary and involuntary behavior. It's like I can voluntarily reach for this, but when I'm paying attention, I'm aware that everything is just happening. Like just the intention to move is just arising. right? And I'm in no position to know why it didn't arise a moment before, or a moment later, or a moment, or 50% stronger or weaker, or so as to be ineffective or to be doubly effective, sort of where I lurched for it versus I moved slow. I mean, I'm not. I, I can never run the counterfactuals. I can never. I mean, all of this opens the door to an even more disconcerting picture along the same lines, which is subsumes this conversation about free will, and it's the question of whether anything is ever possible. Like, what if this is a question I haven't thought a lot about it, but it's been a few years I've been kicking this question around. Um, so, I mean, what if only the actual is possible? What if there was? What if? So we live with this feeling of possibility. We live with the sense that. Let me take. So I have two daughters. I could have had a third child, right? So what does it mean to say that I could have had a third child? Or you don't have kids? I don't think
No,
so.
not that I know of.
Yes.
But the
So
possibility might be
right.
there.
So what do we mean when we say you could have had a child, or you might have a child in the future? Like what is the space in reality? What's the relationship between possibility and actuality and reality? Is there a reality in which non-actual things are nonetheless real? And so we have other categories of like non-concrete things. We have things that don't have spatial temporal dimension, but they nonetheless exist. So like, in the integers, right? So numbers. There's a reality, there's an abstract reality to numbers. And it's philosophically interesting to think about these things. So they're not like, in some sense, they're real, and they're not merely invented by us. They're discovered because they have structure that we can't impose upon them. Right? It's not like they're not fictional characters. Like I mean, Hamlet and Superman also exist in some sense, but they exist at the level of our own fiction and abstraction. But it's like they're true and false statements you can make about Hamlet. They're true and false statements you can make about Superman, because our fiction, the fictional worlds we've created, have a certain kind of structure. But again, this is all abstract. It's all abstractable from any of its concrete instantiations. It's not just in the comic books and just in the movies. It's in our ongoing ideas about these characters. But natural numbers or the integers don't function quite that way. I mean, they're similar, but they also have a structure that's purely a matter of discovery. It's not, you can't just make up whether numbers are prime. If you give me two integers, of a certain size, let's say you mentioned two enormous integers. If I were to say, okay, well, between those two integers, there are exactly 11 prime numbers, right? That's a very specific claim about which I can be right or wrong. And whether or not anyone knows I'm right or wrong. It's like, there's a domain of facts there, but these are abstract. It's an abstract reality that relates in some way that's philosophically interesting, metaphysically interesting to what we call real reality, the spatial temporal order, the physics of things. But possibility, at least in my view, occupies a different space. And this is something, again, my thoughts on this are pretty inchoate, and I think I need to talk to a philosopher of physics and or a physicist about how this may interact with things like the many worlds interpretation of
Yeah,
quantum
like so
mechanics.
that's an interesting, right,
Right.
exactly. So I wonder if discoveries in physics, like further proof or more concrete proof that many worlds interpretation of quantum mechanics has some validity,
Right.
if that completely starts to change things.
But even that's just more actuality. So if I took that seriously,
Ah, sure.
that's a case of, and truth is that happens even if the many worlds interpretation isn't true, but we just imagine we have a physically infinite universe. The implication of infinity is such that things will begin to repeat themselves.
Yeah.
The farther you go in space, right? So, if you just head out in one direction, eventually you're going to meet two people just like us having a conversation just like this, and you're going to meet them an infinite number of times in every, infinite variety of permutations, slightly different from this conversation, right? So, I mean, infinity is just so big that our intuitions of probability completely break down. But what I'm suggesting is maybe probability isn't a thing, right? Maybe there's only actuality. Maybe there's only what happens, and at every point along the way, our notion of what could have happened or what might have happened is just that. It's just a thought about what could have happened or might
So
have
there's
happened.
no, so it's a fundamentally different thing. If you can imagine a thing, that doesn't make it real. So because that's where that possibility exists. It's in your imagination, right?
Yeah, and possibility itself is a kind of spooky idea because it too has a sort of structure, right? So like if I'm going to say, you know, you could have had a daughter, right, last year. Um, so we're saying that's possible, but not actual, right? That is a claim. There are things that are true and not true about that daughter, right? Like it has a kind of structure. It's like,
I feel like there's a lot of fog around the possibility. It feels like almost like a useful
but
narrative.
what does it mean? So like, what does it mean if we say, I just did that, but it's conceivable that I wouldn't have done that, right? Like it's possible that I just threw this cap, but
Right.
I might not have done that,
So
right?
you're taking it very temporally close to the original, like what would appear as a decision.
Whenever we're saying something's possible, but not actual, right? Like this thing just happened, but it's possible that it wouldn't have happened or that it would have happened differently. In what does that possibility consist? Like, where is that?
Yeah.
For that to be real, for the possibility to be real, what claim are we making about the universe?
Well, isn't that an extension of the idea that free will is an illusion, that all we have is actuality, that the possibility is an
Right.
illusion?
Yeah. I'm just extending it beyond
Is there,
human action.
ah,
Like
okay.
this goes to the physics of things. This is just everything. Like we're always telling ourselves a story
Yeah.
that includes possibility.
Possibility is really compelling for some reason.
Well, yeah. Well, because it's. I mean, so this. Yeah. I mean, this could sound just academic, but every backward-looking regret or disappointment and every forward-looking worry is completely dependent on this notion of possibility. Like every regret is based on the sense that something else, I could have done something else. Something else could have happened. Every disposition to worry about the future is based on the feeling that there's this range of possibilities. It could go either way. And, I mean, I know whether or not there's such a thing as possibility, I'm convinced that worry is almost never psychologically appropriate because the reality is that in any given moment, either you can do something to solve the problem you're worried about or not. So if you can do something, just do it, and if you can't, your worrying is just causing you to suffer twice over, right? You're going to get the medical procedure next week anyway. How much time between now and next week do you want to spend worrying about it, right? It's the worry doesn't accomplish anything.
How much do physicists think about possibility?
Well, they think about it in terms of probability more often, but probability just describes, and again, this is a place where I might be out of my depth and need to talk to somebody to debunk this. But the
You do therapy with a physicist.
yeah, but probability, it seems, just describes a pattern of actuality that we've observed, right? I mean, there's certain things we observe, and those are the actual things that have happened, and we have this additional story about probability. I mean, we have the frequency with which things have happened in the past. Um, I can flip a fair coin and I know in the abstract that I have a belief that in the limit, those flips, those tosses should converge on 50% heads and 50% tails. I know I have a story as to why it's not going to be exactly 50% within any arbitrary time frame. Um, But in reality, all we ever have are the observed tosses, right? And then we have an additional story that, oh, it came up heads, but it could have come up tails. Why do we think that about that last toss? And what are we claiming is true about the physics of things if we say it could have been otherwise?
I think we're claiming that probability is true. That just it allows us to have a nice model about the world. It gives us hope
Yeah.
about the world.
Yeah. It seems that possibility has to be somewhere to be effective. It's a little bit like what's happening with the laws of. There's something metaphysically interesting about the laws of nature too, because the laws of nature. So the laws of nature impose their work on the world, right? We see their evidence, but they're not reducible to any specific set of instances, right? So there's some structure there, but the structure isn't just a matter of the actual things. We have the actual billiard balls that are banging into each other. All of that actuality can be explained by what actual things are actually doing. But then we have this notion that in addition to that, we have the laws of nature that are explaining this act. But how are the laws of nature an additional thing in addition to just the actual things that are actually affect causally? And if they are an additional thing, in how are they effective? If they're not among the actual things that are just actually banging around.
Yeah.
And so to some
I
degree,
see. For that, possibly has to be hiding somewhere for the laws of nature
to
to
be
be effective.
possible, like for anything to be possible, it has to
It's a
have,
closet somewhere, I'm sure. It's
this,
just where all the possibility goes.
it has to be attached to something. So
I mean, you don't think many worlds is that?
yeah, well, or
Because
it's
many
just,
worlds still exists.
because we're in this strand of that multiverse,
Yeah.
right? So it's still you have just the local instance of what is actual,
Yeah.
and then if it proliferates elsewhere where you can't be affected by it,
Many
there's more
worlds says
actuality.
you can't really connect with the other.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so many worlds is just a statement of basically everything that can happen happens somewhere. Right. That's,
Yeah.
and that's, I mean, maybe that's not an entirely kosher formulation of it, but it seems pretty close. But there's whatever happens, right? In fact, there's, relativistically, the Einstein's original notion of a block universe seems to suggest this. And it's been a while since I've been in a conversation with a physicist where I've gotten a chance to ask about the standing of this concept in physics currently. I don't hear it discussed much, but the idea of a block universe is that, space-time exists as a totality, right? And our sense that we are traveling through space-time, where there's a real difference between the past and the future, that's an illusion of just our, you know, the weird slice we're taking of this larger object. But on some level, it's like, you're reading a novel. The last page of the novel exists just as much as the first page when you're in the middle of it, and they're just, if we're living in anything like that, then there's no such thing as possibility. It would seem there's just what is actual. So, as a matter of our experience, moment to moment, I think it's totally compatible with that being true. That there is only what is actual, and that sounds to the naive ear, that sounds like it would be depressing and disempowering and confining, but it's anything but. It's actually it's a circumstance of pure discovery. Like, you have no idea what's going to happen next, right? You don't know who you're going to be tomorrow. You're only by tendency seeming to resemble yourself from yesterday. I mean, there's way more freedom in all of that than it seems true to many people, and yet the basic insight is that you're not in the real freedom is the recognition that you're not in control of anything. Everything is just happening, including your thoughts and intentions and moods.
So life is a process of continuous discovery.
You're part of the universe. Yeah, you are just this. I mean, it's the miracle that the universe is illuminated to itself as itself where you sit, and you're continually discovering what your life is. And then you have this layer at which you're telling yourself a story that you already know what your life is, and you know exactly, who you should be and what's about to happen, or you're struggling to form a confident opinion about all of that. And yet there is this fundamental mystery to everything, even the most familiar experience.
We're all NPCs in a most marvelous video game.
Maybe, although my sense of gaming does not run as deep as to know what I'm committing to there.
Are you,
It's a non-playing
are
character.
you
Yeah,
more,
yeah,
yeah, not
yeah,
player? Oh wow,
yeah,
yes,
yeah,
you're more of a Mario Kart guy. I
yeah,
can
yeah.
tell.
I went back. I was an original video gamer, but it's been a long time since I. I mean, I was there for Pong. I remember when I saw the first Pong in a restaurant in I think it was like Benihana's or something. They had a Pong and a table, and
Isn't it
that
amazing
was an
that
amazing moment when you.
you, Sam Harris, might live from Pong to
Yeah,
the invention and deployment of a super intelligent system?
yeah. Well, that happened fast. If it happens any time in my lifetime.
From Pong to AGI.
Yeah.